welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth. Come on.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. So, Gareth, what did we want to talk a bit about today?
You discussed the idea of talking about resilience, and I initially leapt on that idea because I love talking about organizational resilience. And you said, no, you wanted to talk about individual resilience to stress. So I think we'll end up talking about both.
Well, I think these things intertwine with one another, and it's useful to sort of share why this is interesting to me, at least the personal side of things, because I think, you know, I've been doing this job now for a number of years, and often when you meet friends and colleagues you haven't seen for a while, you say, how are things going? And you can then see very quickly, are they looking relaxed, full of the joys of spring or summer, or are they looking a little bit stressed? And I've certainly had that in my time. I've worked in a number of organizations where either things weren't going right, or where organizations where we were going through some significant and complex change. And it really struck me that this idea of resilience, if we sort of take the cliche of being English, you know, we're the country, we're the culture that uses the phrase stiff upper lip. And I think that's a very English way of touching resilience and running away as fast as you can by saying stiff upper lip. So I'm really interested by that idea of resilience.
Yeah.
What happens when things go wrong? What happens when there's major transformation? And specifically the piece about it, the resilience of individuals, whether it be the leader in charge. And I think that's really, really important, but also then the people inside. Now, when we talked about this and you sort of talked about the resilience of teams, I think those are two good things to sort of dive into because I think they feed off each other significantly.
Yeah, I agree. I'm interested about, to follow up on your point about when you talk to friends and you see, you know, the tired dead eyes as they say everything's fine and it's really not, or they say something cliche like, I'm getting along, you know, I'm managing, I'm coping, or and I don't think it's always organizations that are going through change. I think actually I have friends certainly that normal jogging in that organization leaves them clinging on with their fingernails. And what I found quite revealing, I suppose, is I've had some fairly minor mental health issues over the last few years, which I'm sure we'll get into. Clearly, the thing you need to do with mental health issues is to open up and discuss it. And I have been, and I have no issues talking about it. But what I found really interesting is when I've opened up about it, the amount of friends who have perfectly normal, you know, not high stress, I'm not talking about friends in the military doing combat operations. I'm talking about people who have a 9-to-5 or supposedly 9-to-5 office job or managerial job or in the city or wherever, talking about their mental health problems. And when I start that conversation, it's really surprising how big a problem this is. But I think also positive that we're starting to recognize it, we're starting to talk about it. The idea of the stiff upper lip is almost now I think it's
diminishing.
Phrase.
And it's funny, as we were talking about this, what occurs to me, I think a number of episodes back, we talked about diversity and we talked about the moral imperative for diversity and the business imperative. I actually think resilience and sort of mental health and all those sorts of things, there's a similar sort of split there, which says there is the piece of resilience, and definitely that's sort of actually what triggered this, that whole, how do you manage when it's all feeling a bit much for you? There's that sort of personal and moral, and we should look after people because that is the right thing. But there's also that business thing as well. Now, I think the view that revealing that everything isn't great is a sign of weakness. I do feel like at the moment that's diminishing and people are getting much better at that. But
yeah, it
is this idea of, as leaders, we want people to make the best decisions. And from personal experience, I talk about this sort of leadership G-lock. And so what I mean by this is, jet fighter pilots, there is this situation when they're pulling high G. In other words, the blood is being squeezed in the wrong places and away from their brain. And when this situation happens, fast jet pilots are taught to recognize and understand it. There is sort of this gray vision that comes around them. And it's almost, this is showing my age, when you used to have an old TV and sort of analog TV, you pull the plug, the screen goes from being the full size down into 2 inches and then disappears down the hole.
You are showing your age.
I am.
I've seen this in movies.
You see that's a terrible, terrible thing that my cult references. But this idea that as they're flying along, their vision starts to decrease and they can see a smaller and smaller and smaller space in front of them. Now, talking about this from a sort of a resilience perspective, as a leader, I have experienced that says, by the way, over a much longer period, all of a sudden your ability to perceive all the things going around you, your ability to take all the information in, to process it and to make good decisions decreases and decreases and decreases and decreases. And over the years, I've got a little bit better of spotting those signs that actually, oh, hang on a minute, this is a really good one for me. I'm typically very good. I think Typically, I think 2 to 3 weeks ahead. I can tell you what big things are coming up, what activities are going on, strategic goals. I'm very good. When I'm under stress, what I realize is my ability to look ahead starts to decrease. And then the moment it gets to all I can focus is tomorrow, that is a sign I'm in that kind of resilience G-lock, where there is a risk things will go wrong. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk about it, not just to recognize it, to talk about the symptoms and why it's important, but obviously then talk about, some things we can do to build more resilience as we go through. So that's the personal side. I actually want you now to dive in and talk a little bit about organizational resilience, because I think there's a big relationship there.
Yeah, I think there is. And I completely agree with you on the parallels with diversity as well, and that there is a moral imperative to look after our people, which goes hand in hand with the moral imperative to give as wider group of people access, to the workforce and to the opportunity as possible. And like that, there is also a imperative for the business, for the organization. And this is where that crossover sort of links in, where if you don't look after your people, in very much the same vein as if you shut off a whole section of the market and don't offer the opportunity to people, your business suffers. The outcomes of your business suffer. And we've talked in previous episodes about the changing operating environment and the need to be more adaptable, more flexible. And part of that is the ability to cope with change. And if you think about what resilience is as a definition of the word, if you can think about resilience from a individual perspective, you can think about it from an organizational perspective, or you can think about it from a materials perspective. Materials that are resilient are things that, or a level or a measure of resilience is the ability to take impact, a shock, a knock, and repeatedly do that over time. So there's two aspects to resilience. One is how high stress is the impact of the thing that is creating that change, and what is your durability to repeatedly expose yourself to these things. And resilience and stress are clearly very, very closely related. Again, both in a material sense, but also in a psychological sense. And stress is good. We've talked about heuristics, we've talked about biases before. Our ability to respond to high stress environments, high stress things that happen to us is, that's a natural chemical reaction that allows us to focus. So that tunnel vision you're talking about, that fighter pilots feel as a result of G-force, is the body focusing effort onto the thing that matters. And your ability to see out 3 weeks or see out 24 hours is your body
coping. I think that's
and allowing you to focus on what subconsciously it thinks is important, and that's based on, you know, evolution, and isn't necessarily what is actually important. And I think there's an important aspect of that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because resilience isn't something that certainly I've come across people talking a lot about in business. There's this weird thing, which is we want to talk about success, we want to focus on success, and so often resilience and your ability to understand, build your knowledge and understanding of how to deal with it, comes from having been in a bad situation multiple times.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where it's really valuable to stand back and say, how do we think about it? Before we go sort of a bit more into the resilience of a leader or the resilience of a team, you know, I'm fascinated. You sort of said at the beginning, obviously not on the military side, that's a different thing. But actually, let's talk about the military side. So you've been in many situations where you have been in very high stress. I'm going to imagine there have been moments when things weren't going great, and you were at that, it could go very badly. How does the military think and talk about that kind of resilience?
Firstly, I think there's an almost misunderstanding of, you must have been in situations of very high stress. Stress is a chemical response to external events, and actually there's only so much chemical response in any human's, you know, body. And so I quite often get asked that when people sort of go, oh, I can't imagine how stressful it is being in a life and death situation, because I get stressed having to meet a deadline.
Well, probably similar.
The stress level is probably the same. And if you've seen the film The Hurt Locker, I don't know if you have, but it's about the bomb disposal expert and technician. At the end of the film, he's back in the US and really struggling to make mundane decisions. And I think there's a scene in a sort of supermarket where he just doesn't care and cannot decide what breakfast cereal to buy. And that's as a result of, because you've shifted your whole Overton window of what you think stressful situations are, everything at that bottom end, decisions about mundane things, are really, really difficult. And I experienced exactly that. You know, coming back off combat tours, things just don't matter. Things that other people find really important. And so by the way, my first point is stress is there's a level of there. The fact that I've been repeatedly exposed to events that are traumatic, and I certainly have. And I think your question was, you know, how does the military sort of respond to that?
And I think it will be easy for us to sort of fall into only the military can have traumatic events. I've been in my business world for a while, and there are plenty of equally is the wrong word, but I have been in very traumatic events. So this isn't sort of a one-upmanship game, but what's different though is, I think, and using the word trauma, because I think that's quite a good word, and it's trauma brings stress and invites resilience. The one thing I have to believe that the military has thought about, either formally or informally, is, okay, if I'm going to ask someone to go on patrol every day for a week, it is in my interest to arm them with the skill to do that. And if that means you go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, we'll force you to. So, for example, air crew are told go to bed and get good night's sleep, or whether it is when we finish, we go and sit in a room and we have a beer, or whatever we do. How have you dealt with that, or how's the military talked about?
There's two aspects to it. One is a time-honored way of managing future stressful events, which we've talked about, in fact, in the Pirates episode, which is about going through rehearsals, going through that expected, anticipated situation in advance so that you are pre-armed with a way of responding, rather than just instinctively reacting and relying on your, hormone levels to allow you to cope. So the military do lots and lots of training where they expose you to situations where you are going to have to make decisions. And I found this on my first combat tour of Afghanistan. I was really, really scared of going to Afghanistan on operations, not because I was scared of the risk to my life, but I was really scared of letting the team down. I was really scared of being found wanting as a very, very young, I think I was 22 as a troop commander, young officer in charge of Marines, having to make decisions that for the first time were going to be life and death, when all up until that point, apart from, the environment, I've talked about the dangers of being out in Norway and stuff, but suddenly I'm going to have to actually tell people to assault enemy positions, tell people when to fire and not to fire, deal with potential improvised explosive devices. And I was really, really scared of letting people down. And that was the anxiety I had before going. Once I got out there, the moment we found ourselves out on the ground and things started happening, whether that was finding improvised explosive devices, coming under attack from the Taliban, or whatever it was, none of those thoughts were in my mind, and I didn't feel scared in that moment. And that was because the training kicked in and I was concentrating on the process I needed to go through, which is something I knew how to do. I'd done it many times before, and all I needed to do was pause, understand the situation, ask the right questions in my mind, and then make some decisions. Not all of those were right. Context and tactics is a very dependent thing. But at the moment that it happened, I was physically stressed. My heart was pumping at 180 beats a minute. I could hear it in my ears. I got that tunnel vision at least 4 or 5 times on my first combat tour. There was physical stress, but I actually, from a decision-making point of view, felt very, very ready for it. The second element to all of that, of course, is what I talked about before about durability. How do you keep going with that? And also, after the fact, how do you protect your people and how do you protect yourselves when you start to post-mortem,
let's come back to the durability, because I wanted to touch on a couple of those things. There's a real risk that people who haven't been in the military or haven't done that kind of work will say, that's really interesting, but it's not relevant to me. But I think there is a lot more relevancy than anyone might think, because yes. While, and just to get this out of the way, that I'm not playing my business life is just like someone running with a weapon at the Taliban. That's not what I'm talking about. The outcomes are very different. The risk is very different, but really, really interesting when you sort of talk about the fact that you fear something, but when you start, you fall into that rhythm.
Yeah.
This is something I talk a lot. We go from sort of the extreme and the film worthy to the mundane. I am very lucky. I've given many, many presentations to all sorts of people, executives and otherwise. And so actually presentations weirdly become a very comfortable place for me. But many of my team members who just haven't done thousands of presentations, it's nerve-wracking to them. And that you can see them physically becoming stressful, I would imagine, heartbeat goes, all that kind of things. But what's really interesting is almost every single one of them, and I was having this conversation a couple of weeks ago with one of my team members, the moment they start and they talk about something they have competence, knowledge and experience of, as it were, the fear disappears.
Yeah.
And so part of this resilience is, how do you prepare for this? I think that's some of it. But
yeah,
I do think there's another piece as well, which I think is really interesting. And this is maybe focusing more on the role of a leader. And that is, for me, I've mentioned this very briefly in a previous podcast. when something is going wrong, and we, in every business I've been in, there's been that moment when something very bad has happened. A customer is offline, or there's a risk of data breach, or whatever it might be. The first thing that as a leader I need to do is to slow down and actually calm people down, to give them space to think and be proactive.
Yes.
So if I panic, they will panic. If I don't panic and I look confident, sometimes when I'm not confident and I am panicking internally, that can be really valuable as well.
Rich Field mentioned this when we talked to him about the lessons he'd learned from, I think it was an SAS soldier who had given a talk on management tools and had talked about the idea of slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and the idea of slowing things down so you don't allow the anxiety, the stress, the situation to overwhelm you. You don't, I think Rich was talking about taking photos of cars quickly, but you don't fumble and get it wrong. That comes from the close combat world, where you're having to do physical things, change magazines on weapons, bring up your weapon to point it at a target. In the close combat world, you're doing that milliseconds, and if you get it wrong, people, there is a very high risk of people getting killed or seriously hurt, the wrong people. I think that's really important, but I want to go back to your question about how the military prepares, because we've only talked about half the story. And what we talked about there is how you prepare people for that stressful event in advance. Up until probably only 10 or 15 years ago, that was the military's process for managing mental health issues and stress. Was, we'll put people in stressful positions, we'll simulate warfare and combat, and so when they actually face it, they'll be comfortable with it. That second element of resilience is not how hard you're being hit, it's how many times you're being hit.
Well, and how many times before you suffer from being hit. And
so I talked earlier about the fact that I've had some relatively minor mental health issues, but my mental health issues somewhat stem from the trauma that I experienced on various operations, Afghanistan included. And it's not the things that I thought it would be, and it's probably not the things the listeners would expect that are the things that created those mental scars. So for me, I thought it would be being close to death. I thought it would be, those near misses where you hear the crack of the bullet as it breaks the sound barrier over your head. The bits when you get back to the operating base, having just gone through a firefight and find, bits of shrapnel through your rucksack or whatever. Those things create stories. They create they're certainly memorable moments, but actually, for me, it's the things like survivor's guilt, not being hurt when other people were. And as a commander, and I think this would apply whether you're a junior NCO all the way up through to being, a battalion commander or even more senior, the what if questions. Because as I said, I felt very, I wouldn't say comfortable, but I felt ready in that moment to make decisions. And I thought about the situation I was in and I made decisions. Post-event, you then start to self-analyze and you start to ask, could I have done things quicker? Could I have done things better? Would this person still be alive if I hadn't made these decisions? And it's those things that I think once or twice might give you nightmares. Every time you think about it might be quite upsetting, but repeatedly over multiple combat tours, over multiple operations, start to wear you down and take their toll. But I didn't notice.
Well, but I think this is a really interesting thing about resilience, which is you can do the same thing 5 times and be successful and not be affected, whether it's in business or the military. And it's the 6th time, which is exactly the same as the 4th and the 3rd, and all of a sudden something switches.
Yes.
And I think that maybe a different way of saying this, and I know this isn't the right word, but there is a point at which you become tired. There is a point at which your resilience to cope with these things, and it's very quiet. You know, it's that thing where we've all done the same thing, and Bob is quite quiet in the corner. And you say, Bob, what's going on, Bob? We've dealt with this before. We've been successful with this before. And Bob's just got that look of, I need to have a break. I need to do something different. I think that's...
and I think, you know, being tired, talking about it being tired is an analogy, but it's a very, very good analogy, because, you know, 10 years after, you know, these things started to happen, I clearly wasn't still physically tired, but there is an emotional fatigue. There's an emotional tiredness of, there's only so many times that I can go through that thought process, and before it starts to really wear you down and affect your ability to operate in the here and now.
So I mean, I think you know, this is one of those topics where we're definitely going to bounce around. There's no, like, we've got 3 facts we want to communicate. How do you recharge? Whether it was in, you know, Afghanistan, or whether it's in your data, because I'd like to talk about how I recharge, not because I think it's perfect, but I think it's a good interchange. But how do you recharge? What does Gareth do after a difficult week where he's feeling mentally fatigued or stressed, or that resilience? What do you do to, as it were, reset and start again?
So firstly, whenever I now recognize that I am at risk of having been exposed to trauma, and of course my life now is very, very different. I don't go on combat tours, but as we've already said, this doesn't
no, it's not just a military thing. And I think,
or...
and to be clear, I've seen people in business, in the product world, really, really suffer.
Absolutely.
Really,
and it
have
could
to
be,
say, I need to leave my job. I can't do this anymore.
And the amount of friends and colleagues that I know that have, you know, got to a point where they've literally had a panic attack in the middle of a tube station, or having just gone into or just coming out of a meeting, or these things are real in the workplace just as much.
Well, they're real, and actually this is important for everyone to hear, which is, it is almost unusual if you don't feel this. So we are not talking about, you know, Gareth and Chris, who are going to talk about stress and resilience. We're unusual that we've found 2 people. Actually, I would argue if you pick random 10 people at some point in the last year, they were under enormous stress.
Absolutely.
And mental risk in that sense. Sorry, you're talking about what you do to...
So the first thing I do is, once I recognise that I may have been at risk, and the nearest thing I had is, I had a near-miss car accident on my motorcycle last week. It was my fault, actually, and I was concentrating on not hitting a cyclist and a runner in the local country lanes that are quite narrow, and I failed to anticipate the car, and I pulled out in front of the car, and they stopped. They were very aware. I felt very sheepish, but I had that adrenaline pumping through my body, like that was close. As soon as I got home, I replayed that in my mind. I thought about it. I went through it frame by frame, if you like, having calmed down now, and had a cup of tea, and I sat and thought about what I would do differently next time, what went wrong, why did I make that mistake, and then I carried on with the rest of my day. But what that allows you to do is anchor that moment very, very shortly afterward to a whole load of relatively positive feelings of, I am now in control of what happened. I've thought about it. I've post-mortemed it, if you like. What do I do when I'm starting to feel stressed? I do things that I enjoy. It's a really obvious answer, but I do things that challenge my mind and challenge my body. So it's the cliche thing of sport. You know, sport is a really good way of de-stressing because it gives you something to concentrate on. A lot of sports have tactics, potentially strategy. A lot of sports have teamwork, and it's physically arduous and hard. So I will, you know, go and do some sport, or go for a run. But I think the most important thing is I now, having recognized my problems, and to be very transparent and frank about it, I got to a point where I was still serving in the military and I was drinking an awful lot of whiskey on a weekday evening on a school night, and going into work the next day and trying to function. And every evening, rather than going to bed where I knew I was probably going to have nightmares and flashbacks, I would sit and drink. And it started socially, and then I became the only person drinking when everybody else had gone to bed. And then eventually I found myself, alone in the house pouring myself a drink because I didn't want to face going to bed. And that's when I suddenly realized that I had a problem. From that moment, I just talk openly about it.
I think, I'll talk about some of what I do, and not because any of these are right or wrong, but I think the talking about it and being open about it, that, a problem shared is a problem halved.
Yeah.
I know it's a cliche, but I think that's really true. So I was thinking, I do have actually periods of great stress. I actually was working in a business last year where I stayed for actually a relatively brief period of time because it was so stressful. That was a key reason for me leaving that business. Yeah. But actually, I want to go back to my brief time in the Navy. And the reason why I'll tell this story is because I think actually what can be valuable is for you to be self-aware, or one to be self-aware of those symptoms starting. So here is my extreme symptoms, and I can tell you how I behave when I'm under significant stress. The first thing, when I was learning to be a navigator and I was flying and I knew it wasn't going well, I knew I was behind the curve, I wasn't keeping up. And it was stressful to the point where I woke up every morning and the first thing I'd do is go to the toilet block and throw up.
Yeah.
And anyone listening to this will say, well, that is insane. That is clearly you are under that is not normal. I sort of had this G-lock where that was not what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And you get to the point where you think that's normal. So that, I'm very lucky. I've never, I think I've only ever been in that level of stress one other time in my work life. But that was really interesting, where it was an extreme hidden.
Yeah.
Nobody else knew about it. It was something that I did, and that was my body reacting and dealing with it. But more generally, I mean, if I bring it to the less extreme, I guess maybe the point about that is, I suspect most people listening to this will say quietly when no one's around, yeah, I've been in those places and I recognize those, and the reflection can be really, really valuable. But practically, there's some really simple things that I do. And I don't know that these are necessarily right or wrong, but good to talk about. The first one really is sleep.
Yeah.
So I think I'm very lucky. I find it easy to sleep. In fact, I like sleeping a lot. But actually what I found is that the more tired I am, the more physically tired I am, which is often another symptom of stress. Sleeping, that's really, really important. Right now we're in the middle of summer. It's light all the time. It's hot. It's harder. But getting a good night's sleep, that's really important. And often when I go to sleep and I think, here is an intractable problem or a significant problem, weirdly in the morning it feels like less of a problem. There's more clarity, and I now know what the next steps are. So sleep is a big thing. I am not the physical person. For anyone who's met me, you'll be laughing at the moment about the idea that I'd go off and do sport. But actually, I have a PS4 and I put those earphones on and I go onto a first-person shooter and I spend an hour shooting something else. Partly because it allows me to, as it were, shut down and say, I don't have to worry about that. I could go do something else. But this, I think that everyone has their different thing with it. It's walking down by the river, taking a dog for a walk, which I like doing. The one thing I'm more aware of as I go through my career is when you're in those moments of sort of G-lock, as it were, where everything's coming closer and you need to really work hard at managing that stress and managing that resilience. The one thing I've watched that I have to be very, very careful of is shutting other people out. So my family are very good and they're very nice and they're very helpful because they want to support me, but I can see that look in their eyes, which is, you don't want to come and spend any time with us. And so it's very, it's almost the drinking the whiskey is, I want to do this on my own. This is my problem to wrestle with. Not only are actually communicating with the family a really good group of people to give you that support, beware actually there's a risk you make the problem worse, because at the end of the week you say, actually, I'm feeling much better than I did on Monday. And the family says, well, we're not, because you haven't spoken to us.
Yeah, that's very true. Like, I find my family, well, my daughter's probably a little bit young to understand this, but my wife certainly, and my friends are very good at being there, but not being in my face. So if I need them, I know they're there. But Rachel will say, do you need some time on your own? And she'll quite happily, I do like you, I play computer games sometimes of an evening to just think about something else.
It's to zone out.
Yeah, and she'll take herself off and read a book or watch television in another room or whatever. But she always checks that I'm okay. If she goes to bed before I do, the next morning, the first thing she'll do is say, you were a bit stressed last night, or you told me you weren't feeling great. Are you okay? And so it's just knowing they're there without being in your face. But I think I'd like to bring this element of talking about mental injury to a sort of close, because it's worth recognizing that we're talking about mental health. Resilience is about having good mental health. And like physical injury and physical health, the two things are very, very closely related. And if you have good physical health, you're far less likely to pick up injuries. You're also going to heal quicker. And of course, the big difference is it's far harder to see a mental injury or the level of somebody's mental health. But we are talking about health. So a lot of the things we've talked about, talking, post-morteming the incident at the closest point you can, these have now been formally taken up by the military in a program that we call Trauma Risk Management, or TRIM. And people are trained to be TRIM managers. And they're not psychologists, there's no medical training. This is just an ability to immediately after a potential impact, a potential traumatic incident, to hold a workshop where they talk about it. Or if you recognize in somebody the behaviors that might indicate their mental health is not as good as it should be, or they're carrying or potentially carrying a mental health injury. We're going to talk on a podcast in a few weeks, I think, about the role of padres. This absolutely fits with the role of padres. They're not just there to espouse religious dogma. They're there to be part of that pastoral care, to look after the health, the mental health, the spiritual health of the individuals that make up the team. And I think that's a really important point, because I don't know of an organisation outside of the military that formally has, and I'm sure there are some organisations that do this, but I don't know of any, and I've never come across any, that formally have somebody in that role. And yet, as we've talked about already for the last half an hour, people do get themselves to the point where their mental health gets to the point where they start to injure themselves. And I would advocate for people, whether it's their primary role or whether it's a secondary role, or whether it's just you build a culture of people look out for each other, actually starting to implement formally processes to be able to watch for the signs and to support the people that are struggling.
I think that's a key role of any manager and any leader, to do that within their teams. Well, look, let's take a quick break. Actually, I think I'm really pleased we talked about sort of the mental resiliency side of things. And I think that when I talked about resiliency, that was a key part of it. Let's come back after the break. There's a couple more points I want to sort of raise on that, but then maybe we can dig in a bit more on a slightly different version of that, which is resiliency of organization. So
yeah,
I'll be back in a second. Welcome back. Well, we spent the first half of the podcast talking about resiliency within leadership, why this matters, some examples of how we've personally seen how that can impact us, and just some thoughts on how we tackle some of that and why that's important. But, you know, in terms of a leader, resilience, I think there's lots in there. So the first thing is that I mentioned before, which I think it's really important as a leader to be seen and perceived to be resilient. And that's not me going back on what we said before. It is a key role of a leader is when things start to go wrong, people will look at you, and that sets the tone of how they think about it. The other thing, which I think is, you know, I think we'll talk more about how you become more resilient. I don't know if this is bad news, but experience is one of the most valuable things. When you've done it multiple times, automatically your heuristics say, I know the likely outcomes. I also know that I've dealt with them. And so it's much easier. So that doesn't help people who are sort of early on this track, but it maybe goes to this point about, you know, practicing. I think practice is not quite as good as the real thing with experience, but practice, I think, gets you there as well.
But this comes back to our previous points about wargaming, scenario development.
Absolutely.
You don't have to be in the high stress, you know, mergers and acquisition that's happening right now, and the lawyers are on you and the boss is on you, and you can simulate that or emulate it through wargaming. And the brilliant thing about a wargame is nobody dies.
Yeah.
And in the business world, nobody gets fired.
Yeah, nobody goes bankrupt.
Nobody loses money.
The customer data is still there.
You don't get sued, but you do start to build that experience that otherwise you're relying on literally, you know, going through it when it happens, and that can take years. Well,
and what I think the practice does, because this is again, one of the things, this is going way back, and you'll laugh at the Fleet Air Arm thing of this, which was, we were part of the course I did when I was learning to be a navigator was what they call conduct after capture.
Yep.
And it's the sense that if we, you probably have a slightly different version of what we did, but what it was that it was helping you practice for the scenario that you were being captured, and it was all about helping you understand what would happen and how to deal with it. And one of the things that the instructors talked about in the military is very, very good at understanding this, was when you capture somebody, the interrogators will put you under enormous stress to discombobulate you. In other words, the point is, at the moment of stress, the more stress there is, the harder it is for you to deal with anything. And so by practicing this and overcoming that initial, this bad thing has happened, if you can get past it, it's really important. So the reason for that is you know you're doing well when you can go beyond something's gone terribly wrong, oh my God, how do I recover? And something has gone terribly wrong. How do I reframe that? How do I find new opportunities? How can I think of novel ways? So really the first bit of surprise and stress and everyone running around like a headless chicken, the goal is to get through that as soon as possible so that you can get to the really good stuff. And this is I guess I've just for the last 30 seconds been talking about incidents almost, but actually I've been in businesses where, I've been in a number of businesses where when I've joined, actually there's been a history of bad things happening. And what's very common when I found that is when something bad happens, people fall into this common, well, this always happens to us. This is a typical example. And so people get focused on the negativity and get caught in this trap of not moving forward. When, you know, if you're calm, if you have a vision, if you have something people can follow, if you've got a calm voice, actually the most valuable thing is say, great, person X, I want you to go do this. Person Y. All of a sudden, when people are busy and focused on the solution, all of a sudden it's people immediately forget, well, this has happened before. Well, that's not interesting actually right now. And so it's pushing people forward onto that track of how do we solve it? How do we get creative? How do we get productive? And
what we saw that in COVID, didn't we? Where one of the first things that happened as people started to deal with the economic changes in the environment was they stopped investing in training and investing in people. They got rid of lots of people, sometimes for very obvious and good fiscal sort of health of the organization reasons, but very, very short-termist in view, and then were almost taken off guard when things open back up and their people aren't experienced enough to deal with things. They don't have enough people. And I think that is a really good example of organizationally where that tunnel vision, that G-lock, the organization has said, this stressful thing is happening. We need to hunker down and sort of wait for the storm to clear. And actually, in most situations where things are stressful, the last thing you want to do is ignore the cause of that stress. You want to be proactive in working out what's caused it and what the solution is, whether that's an immediate solution or whether that's a strategic planning for the longer term, rather than we're going to batten down the hatches and wait.
We've mentioned to you before that we record these a little bit in advance so that we're always busy and we never know quite when we'll be able to record. Today there was an interview. It's a Sunday morning, and there was an interview with Rishi Sunak, and I was really struck by something he said on one of the Sunday programs, where he was asked about how people should feel about their mortgages going up significantly, and his statement was, people should just hang in there. And what struck me about that was exactly what you've just said. It was a very negative, inward looking. If we ignore it, but we ignore it for long enough, it will get better. And I mean, this is a sort of a personal view, which is him saying hang in there does not help me pay my mortgage every month.
No.
And actually demonstrates I'm not sure you understand the pain of this.
And
as opposed to if he'd have said something like, we are doing these 3 things to bring down inflation or to help people who can't pay their mortgages, that I think that really touches on your idea of hoping the problem will go away, or saying it will go away if we ignore it for long enough is not a solution, and I thought that was a really good example of very poor leadership, as opposed to a leader who says, I hear, I empathize, I understand, and here is a plan that we can all engage and participate with to move forward.
And I think, again, that's where there's firstly a lack of empathy and a disconnect between people's personal stress and the feelings they will be having as a result of this cost of living crisis. But secondly, from an organizational perspective, and I'm talking here about the nation and its economic health, a complete mismanagement of articulating the resilience that is required and needed. What you're basically saying by saying you've just got to hold your nerve, and I think that's what was said, is basically we've got to be resilient. Well, that doesn't help you become more resilient. What you need is the leader to set out the vision of why the course we're on, the choices we're making are over the long term going to get us out of this situation. And of course, when bad things happen, that doesn't mean that everybody's going to come out of it absolutely fine. What it means is they're thinking about what's best for the organization. They're thinking about the people within that organization, and they're trying to align those things to get us out of this stressful situation in the best way possible. The really important parts for me about organizational resilience is recognizing that resilience isn't just stress management. Resilience is about being adaptive to changing environments on an enduring basis. It's that duration. How many knocks can we take before the system collapses? How do we, every time we take a knock, rebuild a little bit so that we are enduring through this system change? There's, for me, 3 really important aspects to this. One is when the organization is facing a change, so are the individuals in that organization. We've talked before about team, task, and individual. And so if the organization is feeling stressed and feeling like it's in an uncomfortable new ground, Well, you can bet your bottom dollar that people in that organization are feeling also stressed, and for them, this is an emotional problem. So as a good manager, a good leader, you have to recognize that, anticipate it, and do something about it. But also, you want to try and create the narrative that we are facing this as a team. And I think this is where, for me, the military does things really, really well, is we build resilient teams. We build teams that actually thrive on uncertainty. And I experienced this, I'm going to go back to my first combat tour of Afghanistan, where each of the companies, I was part of a unit called 4-5 Commando, and each of the companies, we would hear sort of snippets of information, rumors or little bits of information about what the other companies were up to, where they were, because they were in different parts of Helmand province. And there was this competition of how much harder our life is compared to them. It's a bit like the two Ronnies sketch. And it was like, oh, you're living off 10-man ration packs, luxury. We're only living off 24-hour rations. Well, you're living off 24-hour rations, luxury. We haven't had a resupply for 3 weeks. We're having to make do with, just drinking.
I was about to say, did you get to drinking their own urine?
Not quite. But there was this kind of, people were being competitive about how arduous the conditions were. And it's because we've created teams that absolutely embrace the discomfort of combat.
Well, I think it's embrace it and turn it into a positive thing.
Yeah.
Very military humor, which is, how bad our life is compared to yours. But actually, that's a perfect example of, it might seem to an outsider like that's focusing on the negatives, but I know for sure everyone would have been laughing as they talked.
But what it created was, for each troop or each company in these locations, was a sense of we're facing
esprit de corps. Esprit de corps. I think
so you've got to face these problems as a team, because that's how you, firstly, everybody keeps the spirits up, and secondly, that's how you notice the people that aren't coping quite as well.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is, and we've talked about it and alluded to it quite a bit, is to be strategic. And people are probably getting bored of me saying this, but strategy is not just having a plan. Strategy is anticipating the uncertainty of the environment. Well, nothing says uncertainty like the need for resilience. So be strategic. We come back to think about what your long-term plan is. If something has knocked you off your plan, and I'm going to go back to, I don't know if you remember, right in the early first or second episode where I talked about the compass bearing is a good analogy for strategy.
Yeah, I think it's great.
If something has knocked you off your course, your compass bearing has to change. But that doesn't mean the end goal has changed. What it means is you've recognized that you are dealing with the immediate consequence of whatever's happened, and now you're going to have to do a reset. If you don't do that, and if the leaders and the managers of the organization don't articulate that and take you on that journey, then you can quite often feel like you're heading off in the wrong direction whilst fighting the fire. And that's okay sometimes. And actually, it's for the leader to say, we are not on track to hit our strategic goals, but that is because we're dealing with this pandemic or this supply chain issue, but we recognize that, and we're going to have to do a reset to get back on course once we've hit these goals.
Well, this isn't quite the same, but there's something which, as we talk about resilience, I'm sure we're going to do one of our podcasts around Elon Musk, because I think he's really interesting. Put Elon to one side, though.
One of our influencers podcast.
Yeah, one of our influencers. So hopefully you'll listen to the first one around Steve Jobs and found that interesting. But what's really interesting to me around SpaceX was the fact that depending on which lens you go through there, they should have miserably failed, because these rockets kept blowing up.
Yes.
How on earth could you stay resilient? Everyone was, many people were laughing at them and saying, you'll never make it work. This is ridiculous. You're celebrating that a rocket got off the ground, but it blew up just off the ground. How can it is? Actually, what they did was really good, was they defined what success was. And so weirdly, every time the rocket blew up on the pad, They cheered.
A learning opportunity.
This was this was a learning opportunity. And so I could imagine an organization that would have done exactly the same thing as SpaceX and felt terrible that they were failing time and time again. And a different organization, SpaceX, arguably, that said, well done us. We got it off the ground, guys. We've learned some more. Next time, we're going to try and get it 100 foot in the air. And so that setting, I think that the reason why I brought that one up was I think the North Star was we're going to Mars.
Yeah.
And along the way,
your BHAG,
a bunch of rockets are going to blow up. And that's not bad in a sense. Yeah. That's actually, every time it blows up, we've learned something new. So I think that's a really good example of your strategic focus on the North Star. Yeah. And the short-term disruptions become opportunities for improvement as opposed to failure.
Yeah, and I think that's a classic example of an organization that has built-in resilience. The final thing, I think, for me is to respond to crises, to respond to change, rather than to react to change. And by that, I think I've talked about this before, but by that I mean the things that you know you're going to have to do, you have practiced to the nth degree. So those become muscle memory things. It's the reason we do fire drills. We've talked about this before. So if you know you are going to need to respond to a crisis, or when a crisis hits, there are things you know how to do. You do those things based off corporate memory, based off individual muscle memory, because you've practiced them, you've talked about them, you've got contingency plans on the shelf that you can pull out. The things that you didn't anticipate, haven't anticipated, haven't wargamed, the black swans, the things that are starting to, as you say, discombobulate your decision processes, that is where you have to take that step back, and slow is smooth and smooth is fast. That's where panicking or shifting the blame or throwing the problem to somebody else so you don't have to deal with it actually exacerbates the stress levels within the organization and probably is going to make solving that problem harder. Actually, if you stop and ask the question of what is happening, what do I need to know, what has changed, how does this affect us in terms of achieving our North Star or our long-term strategic goals, who does this affect, what are the immediate things I need to do to put out the fires, and what do we now need to start anticipating for the knock-on consequences, the knock-on effects of this initial change. So the first thing that should have happened when the COVID virus broke out of China and hit Italy was organizations should have been having resilience meetings to say, what happens when this comes to the UK? Might not, but what happens if? What's the worst case scenario? How would we adapt to a reality where flights are cancelled? How do we adapt to a scenario where there's lockdowns? How do we adapt to a scenario where we have to furlough workers? Those kind of things, easy to say in hindsight, but are we now learning and thinking about what the next major global crisis is and running through these
there's two
pre-mortems, if you like.
Two pieces that are really important. The first one is these things are cheap to do.
Yep.
You've talked about this. There was a company you worked with where you did some of this, as in it is not that you have to spend months and months and millions. It can be on a whiteboard in half an hour. So this is not expensive to do or difficult to do. But the second thing, which is why, I'm gonna make this three things, but the second thing is remember, when talking about it today, we're relaxed, it's a nice Sunday afternoon, the sun is shining, it's easy to talk about what to do when things go wrong. But remember, when things go wrong, it's a very different world. The decisions because the G-log, the decisions you make, you're already by definition probably going to make worse decisions than you would have done in a calm. So this is why this stuff is so important. It is going to be harder. It is harder when the bullets are flying. It is harder when the P1 situation has hit and there's a possibility there's been data loss.
And I think there's a really important point we made in the first half where we were talking about individual stress. And we were saying that stress is pretty standard for people, the situations that cause stress are different. As an organizational leader, it is your responsibility to recognize that. And so it might not be a situation that's going to bankrupt the company. It might not be keeping you up at night, but it might be keeping some of your people up at night. And if you don't know or recognize that, then you can't implement those things that are going to help them, that will make them feel better and be more effective. And so stress is not, I suppose what I'm saying is you can't measure other people's stress by how you would cope in that situation.
Yeah, that's well said. And the last thing for me about this was the whole series of these podcasts is about how to potentially build a better team, be better leaders. And people must be sick of this now, it is like a recipe for a cake. You can't just turn up and say, I haven't spent any time on my team. I haven't spent any time building empowerment or empathy. You can't, when these things go wrong, that's the time when you understand, did I do all those other things? All those other things, which at the time, maybe they felt a bit fluffy. Well, empowerment, I'm not in a business that needs empowerment. I can just tell them what to do. Actually, all of those things you are doing, if for no other reason, for that moment when it goes wrong, where you need a team that says, boss, I've had an idea, I can go away and do this for you. Or someone who says, Chris, you're not looking great today. Go off this afternoon, do something else. We've got this for you. I think it's really important. Well, look, we're coming towards the end, and I scribbled a few things down. What's been nice is, we've talked about this, but I wanted to scribble a few things down that struck me as things to leave people with to think about doing. And I think most of these probably focus on the leadership resilience or the self. So maybe you can sort of follow up with some of the organizational, but experience really matters. I know you can't go out tomorrow and make experience, but it does matter. Panic is really bad in these situations. Practice controlling your emotions. Trust your team. Encourage others. There was one other point that someone made to me a while ago, which is about gratitude. And I try really hard, I hope I did this okay, which is showing genuine gratitude to the team. It's all gone horribly wrong. They dug in for you. Go find them, put your hand on the shoulder and say, thank you. I saw what you did. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that goes in line with what we've said before about, you can punish negligence, but you should never punish mistakes or bad results, because if people are trying hard and things are going wrong, it might be that it's out of their control. It might be a new situation. It might be outside of their experience. It's a learning opportunity. But even if they perceive that they might be in trouble, they'll either hide it from you or they'll just be really stressed about it.
And when they do a good job, thank them for it. And it's not just congratulate them for them, but thank them. I found that to be a really powerful thing, which is literally, how often do people come up to you and say, thank you? Well, I don't have to thank you. I pay you. No. This is different. This is, I want to thank you because I know you personally engaged in a way you didn't before. You've talked about articulate and engaging vision. If we're in that situation where we need resilience, it's important to know, why should we be resilient? Because I could bail. I could go play golf this afternoon.
And there's plenty of stories of companies where they're facing financial difficulty and the employees have offered up to work for free or to work on reduced rates. That won't happen if they don't believe in the company, if they don't believe in the leaders of that company.
And there's a self version, which is know your purpose as well. Why are you doing it? Again, in the same way the team could rap and say, we're going now, what's yours? We didn't talk about this much, but build a support network. We've done this actually in previous podcasts, which is, who is going to help when things are going wrong? Who's going to watch out for you, whether it's you watching out for your team members watching out for you, or all those other teams. I scribbled down, embrace a curious mindset to avoid the problems in the first place. Let's see if we can figure out what are the problems that could come. You gave a really good example with COVID. And then, as I've said, it's really important to be able to move people on to focus on the solutions. communication really matters in times of uncertainty. There's nothing like misunderstanding to screw up your plan.
But of course, you've got to build those relationships before the emergency. We talked about that.
You must have listened to an earlier podcast. Actually, we recorded an earlier podcast. Encourage innovation and adaptability in the face of challenges. This is, again, you want people to say, this is a crazy idea, boss, but I was thinking about this. Could we solve the problem this way? Get enough sleep.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me. I like sleeping. Look after one another and make sure the team is healthy and happy. This is why, and it's funny, I've heard lots of people talk about this. Someone on my team right now has a meeting where they bring their team together, and it's a meeting where there's no work to be discussed. It's what are you doing this weekend? How are you doing? That's a person investing in the bank of making sure I know how my team are and building that team.
And we've talked about that before. Again, this is intangible value that you can't measure, but is absolutely crucial to organizations working. So I really like that list, and I don't have a lot to add from an organizational perspective, other than to re-emphasize the fact that there isn't one leader who needs to do all this and make sure people are doing it. Your point about having a network, working as a team and looking after each other, this is about, if you're at the top of the tree, making sure the people below you are also leading, are also taking care of their people, because the bigger the organization, the less time or opportunity you're going to have to notice this. And also, this is everybody's responsibility. So I think, I would emphasize that this is a command and leadership challenge, and it's a command and leadership challenge that once again has to start now, not how do I look after people during the crisis. And I absolutely emphasize your point about encouraging innovation and adaptability and creativity, which we've talked about before. I would say formalize that as best you can. Take the time, take the capacity to red team, to war game, to measure and understand your operating environment, to create really good feedback loops so you can sense change as it's happening, rather than when the chaos and the crisis hits. So if you're going into it with your eyes open, having thought about there is a possibility of this crisis, you're going to be far, far better prepared than if the first thing you know about it is that phone call at 2 a.m. to say, boss, there is a crisis. I think that's probably a really good time to bring this to a close. Thank you, Chris. I think that was a really useful conversation. Those two elements that we talked about, both individual resilience and collective team and organizational resilience, I think hopefully we've got the point across that they are symbiotic and one won't work without the other.
So let's call it for today. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. So thanks from me, Chris Kitchener.
Wonderful. Thanks from me, Gareth Tennant. Cheerio.